Welcome to the final session of the 2022 Bruegel annual meetings. It is my really great pleasure to welcome Paolo Gentiloni to Bruegel. Commissioner Gentiloni will deliver the closing keynote of our conference on the EU economic agenda going forward. He needs no introduction. He is the Commissioner for Economy, and of course, the former Prime Minister of Italy. So we have agreed that the Commissioner will speak for about 15-20 minutes. I may ask one or two questions, but we will get to the floor very, very quickly. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I take the opportunity also to thank Guntram Wolf for all its activity in the past decade and to congratulate you, Jeronim, for taking this responsibility. I understand you are quite happy to have it, and it will be in interesting times. So I think we all know that we are heading towards one of the most challenging winters in generations. We have a number of warning lights flashing red. Energy prices have shattered new records. Inflation has continued to climb. Economic sentiment is deteriorating, and the Russian war continues. Developments in European gas markets have dominated the headlines in recent weeks. At the end of August, the TTF gas price stood at more than 15 times the pre-pandemic price and almost twice the level recorded 2 months ago when we had our summer forecast. Inflation continued to rise and, as you know, is now at 9.1%. Energy prices remain the main driver of inflation. The energy component is now around 38% in inflation, but price pressures have broadened in recent months. Core inflation, indeed, is at 5.5%, the highest point since the introduction of the euro. And there are several worsening elements on the outlook. The economic sentiment indicator that the Commission provides, as well as other indicators like the PMI, are heading in the wrong direction. Financing conditions are tightening both in Europe and globally. The euro has slipped below parity with the dollar for the first time in 20 years. And developments in the US and China mean external demand will remain weak. And yet, we should always remember that it's not all doom and gloom, because in the first half of the year, the European economy continued to have a path of growth, and a growth better than we even ourselves expected. So we had 0.8% in the first quarter and 0.7% in the second quarter. This means that EU GDP is now more than 2% higher compared to pre-pandemic levels. And labor markets are performing well. You know that we have a historic low at 6% of unemployment. And even on the energy front, we have some good news. For example, we already reached our 80% storage target that was scheduled for the end of October. Oil and food prices have come down from recent heights. Well, down it's a little bit an understatement, but they have come down. And the same for food. supply chain disruption are easing as port congestion in the US and China decreased significantly. So these developments will reduce inflationary pressures, and inflation may have reached its peak and begin to go down at a certain point next year. Half of the year, well, avoid forecasts because we had wrong forecasts about this in several times. So the main point is that we have an extraordinary level of uncertainty. But overall, the risk of a recession is rising, and the outlook crucially depends on developments in energy markets. Given the level of uncertainty, let me also say that extending the application of the General Escape Clause was the right thing to do. And I know that there are different opinions, but I'm more than ever convinced that it was the right thing to do. Of course, we now need to make sure that fiscal policy does not increase inflationary pressures. The goals of fiscal policy in this phase should be quite simple, three mainly. First, to protect the most vulnerable for the impact of high energy price. Measures should be temporary and compatible with the green transition and better targeted. 3/4 of the measures taken so far, and according to our estimate, the measures taken so far are 0.9% of GDP in the first 7 months of the year, 0.9, which means that yearly we will reach more or less 2% of GDP in this kind of expenditures. But until now, they are not sufficiently targeted. Second, provide humanitarian assistance to those fleeing Ukraine. And third, to expand public investment for the green and digital transition and for energy security. These are three simple goals for fiscal policy. On energy, I think we have to build on some results that we already achieved and that are not frequently seen and discussed. The main result is that the EU has made good progress in reducing our dependence on Russian fossil fuels. Very good progress. Diversification of supplies has resulted in a substantial increase of non-Russian LNG, plus 57% this year, the non-Russian liquefied gas, meaning we were able to make up for the reduced import from Russia. Gas consumption in general dropped by 14% between March and May 2022, compared to the same period in 2021. And gas storage, as I told before, could reach 90% by November. So accelerating the rollout of energy efficiency measures and boosting the uptake of renewables must also continue at full speed to reduce fossil fuels consumption. And we are at a turning point. I think we are now overcoming our divisions. And finally, action is also possible to cap the price of Russian oil and gas and to find ways to intervene in the energy market to decouple electricity and gas prices. In parallel, the implementation of Member States' Recovery and Resilience Plan is continuing. We have so far disbursed 113 billion to Member States, and we expect more payment requests soon. And RRF investments are starting to have tangible effects on the ground. Going forward, delivering on what we have agreed on from the RRF to Repower EU will be key. But implementation, as always, is not everything. We must continue to raise the level of ambition to make progress in other crucial areas. And one of my top priorities for the coming months is to move forward quickly with our fiscal rules review. Our economic governance framework has become far too complex and hard to navigate. It relies on unobservable and backward-looking indicators. National ownership has been too low and enforcement insufficiently effective. And the pandemic has left a legacy, which is a legacy of significantly higher public and private debt. You know that the public debt in the euro area is not far from 100% in average. The need to rebuild fiscal buffers is clear, but debt reduction strategies must be realistic if they are to ensure stability and support growth. At the same time, the challenges of the twin transition and the new geopolitical landscape compel us to undertake major investments and reforms. So as I frequently remember, we have two mountains. Yes, a mountain of public debt, but also a mountain of investments to climb. And how to conceal these two things is the core discussion on our rules. So what we need is a governance framework that allows us to better respond to our common policy priorities for the next decade. Since we relaunched the debate on the review, it was a little bit an unfortunate debate because it was relaunched in January 2020. And then a few weeks after the pandemic came, then the war, but now we are there. Since we relaunched the debate in October last year, we had very constructive discussions with government stakeholders, and let me also thank Bruegel for its contribution to this debate. Now it's time to draw our conclusion. In the coming weeks, we will put forward our orientations on possible changes to this framework. Simplification, stronger national ownership, and better enforcement will be the defining features. Simplification, stronger national ownership, better enforcement. Defining features of an improved framework with the overall objective of supporting debt sustainability and sustainable growth. One way to do so could be to move towards medium-term macro-fiscal plans that set net expenditure paths over several years and are consistent with the convergence of debt to prudent levels. Having one expenditure indicator could go a long way towards simplifying the system while keeping the focus on fiscal risks. Medium-term macro-fiscal plans could also include investment and reform commitments reflecting EU and national priorities and high-level guidance to member states. The design, governance, and operation of the RRF is a useful blueprint in this respect. To ensure greater national ownership, member states could be granted greater leeway in proposing fiscal trajectories, provided common EU principles are respected, not least, of course, debt sustainability. For example, reform and investment commitments could allow for a longer fiscal adjustment period, more gradual. This would also be a way to ensure fiscal sustainability and growth can be mutually reinforcing. A greater ex-ante national ownership of the design of fiscal trajectories could be balanced by a stronger ex-post enforcement at EU level. This is the deal, the potential deal in substance. I believe that changes to our fiscal rules in this sense, accompanied by an improved macroeconomic imbalances procedure, could deliver a more coherent and integrated framework for economic governance. And I believe that these elements could gather broad support among member states. And it's time to move on, leaving behind the traditional divide. By the way, moving quickly towards a common understanding will also send a strong and reassuring message to markets. And we need it. Just think to the liquidity problems raising from the electricity futures market, just to mention another aspect of concern that we have in these weeks. But let me recall that the ECB has pegged its new transmission protection instrument to compliance with our common fiscal rules, among other things. So to have new agreed fiscal rules is also very important in this respect. In conclusion, winter is coming. The European economy is facing serious challenges. While 2022 as a whole will be a growth year, the momentum is slowing and a recession cannot be ruled out. High energy prices will test our economic and social fabric. But if we remain united, ambitious, and ready to intervene as needed in a spirit of solidarity, we can ensure that the coming months will not be remembered as the winter of our discontent, but as the harbinger of a new European spring. And with this note of optimism, I thank you very much for your attention.
So, Commissioner, thank you so much. Very, very nice overview, and of course, much to agree with. Thank you also for giving us a little bit of a preview of what may be in the fiscal rules a proposal. So let me start by asking maybe one or two questions, and we'll throw it open to the floor. So you end with this sentence that high energy prices will test our economic and social fabric. And in a sense, they will also test our political and institutional fabric. And what I mean by that is that they will test what I would characterize as relatively cohesive response of EU member countries, not only to the pandemic crisis, but also to this shock. No? And of course, the cohesion in part comes from the fact that it is clearly an outside shock, that it is existential for the EU, so you would expect cohesion. But it also, I think, comes from the fact that the cliches about who is vulnerable in Europe and who is not did not apply in this crisis, which I think is a healthy development. Nonetheless, as the energy security issue really becomes existential in the winter, there is a potential for division. How would I know, as an outside observer, that Europe is going to continue managing this crisis well? So how would I recognize if the political fabric of Europe is passing the test? Do you foresee, particular policy actions that would require widespread support by member states for us to be able to say that we are on the right track? Do you foresee maybe policy actions, or if you like, concessions, gestures by individual countries that would give us the reassurance that we continue to be on the right track? So, what is a cohesive way forward, if you can develop that a little bit?
Well, first of all, I fully agree with your view that not only our economies, but also our institutions and our political role will be tested by this energy emergency in the coming weeks and months. Until now, I think we had a strong and cohesive reaction. It happened that I became foreign minister of my country a few months after the Crimea annexation, and I remember very well how difficult it was to agree at the time in 2014, I think, on, honestly, very light packages of sanctions. It was very difficult, but it was very light. Now we agreed on 6 different packages of sanctions, and they are not at all light. So cohesion worked. I don't want to bother you with figures, but if we look to the consumption of Russian gas in the last 6 months, the drop is enormous. Storage. So, okay, now how will we understand if this works in the coming weeks and months? Well, I think that something happened in August, honestly. Not only that we had our pause, but also that the level of divisions among European member states decreased substantially. And so this, I think, was also a trend allowing the Commission in the past couple of weeks to start a frenetic work on to table proposals to address the crisis. In this package of proposals, there is nothing simple, honestly. But I think there is first a clear political intention to reduce high prices, oil through the G7 initiative, gas through a European initiative. There is a clear intention to make further step on the reduction of demand. Also, not to undermine the green transition. There is a clear intention to move towards a decoupling, because this is not something that you can make so quickly, but first step could be made quite quickly, decoupling the gas from the electricity market as a whole, and also to find ways, if possible, to intervene in this very volatile market of futures, of energy, and the burden that they bring to some companies for the call of collaterals, and the risk that this is augmenting the risk, the financial risks in this situation. So all this menu is there. The legal tools to address this menu will be different. Something will be addressed probably through the famous 122 article of the treaties, others more connected to the sanction mechanism in the different way, requiring, as you know, unanimity. Others, like the oil cap, are connected to a broad global initiative and coalition. But something decisively new happened, in my view, in the last weeks, and this is the awareness that, okay, we acted on differentiation, on storages, not so much on common procurement, but now time is there to act much strongly. And the Commission, I think, will look to the discussion of the ministers on Friday and take the orientation of this meeting as a guidance to put on the table very quickly a first set of proposals. Don't expect that all the issues that I touched upon will be transformed in proposals in 3 days, of course. It will be a sequence, but the sequence should start soon.
Right. So if I understand you correctly, the signal will be, in a sense, the ability to coalesce around a meaningful package that addresses, some of these problems in the markets, but also, in particular, the common procurement issue, right?
Common procurement is, of course, easy to say and to ask, but not
yes.
easy to...
That's right. Yeah.
Because we all have a very difficult benchmark, which is the vaccine, the common procurement. But we also know very well that here we have to do with the
yes.
giant companies, contracts of
yes.
10, 15 years. So it's not something that you solve in a minute.
Right.
But at the same time, we know that market is moving, that the scarcity of energy is also moving the market. I was impressed this morning. One of my colleagues told me that in the Panama Canal there are ships transporting liquefied gas that are doing the canal twice. Once, then they get a better price and they go back. So they move through the canal according to the price they get. So this is the volatility of the market we are in. But it is reasonable, especially if we work for a price cap, that we work for a strong on common procurement. The two things are also a little bit connected.
Absolutely. Let me ask you one question on Ukraine and on financial support for Ukraine. Maybe after that we can open to the floor. So there has been considerable help for Ukraine, but it's an enormous problem which may be there to stay for some time. So it is my view that the macro outlook in Ukraine, or the macro situation, is probably not sustainable without an increase, a substantial increase in the regular volume of financial support. And so I do not mean military hardware, which of course is absolutely critical. I just mean fiscal and balance of payment support. So first, I wonder whether you agree with me with that premise. And then the second question is, to the extent that it is a politically hard decision to increase these support levels on at least over the next months, possibly years, a sustained basis. Will we need a governance structure to make sure that this money is spent the way that it should be spent? Or are the, if you like, existing instruments enough? And if we do need a separate governance structure, how intrusive should it be? Can it be done through existing institutions or not? But maybe this is the wrong way to think about it. It may be that, in fact, the spending is not the main constraint, how it is spent, that, ultimately it is simply difficult to raise these sorts of funds, even with the optimal structure to monitor them. So feel free to disagree with the premise of my question.
Well, of course, our priority now is to help the Ukrainian economy. I think the European Union, if we consider the dimension of our budget, did an excellent work on this. If pledges will be fulfilled, at the end of this year we will have 30 billion of international aid, mixing grants and loans to Ukraine, and $30 billion. Well, now it's more or less.
It doesn't matter anymore. Yes.
And our part will be a little bit more than 10, so comparable to US. And I mean the European Union part, not then there is other, perhaps 5 billion or 6 coming from European member states to this contribution. So if you sum up EU and member states, half of the support to Ukraine is coming from us. And then there is a big contribution from US and others. These contribution, for example, the 5 billion of macro-financial assistance that we just are delivering, are connected to a very, very light level of conditionalities. If we compare this with other macro-financial assistance program that we have, I think this is correct. They are not completely void of conditionalities, but there is nothing comparable to a traditional MFA or IMF program. Of course, in the coming period, and especially when the war will be over, this mix will change. How can we coordinate this? I think that we have our own instruments. The macro-financial assistance program of the Commission is already taking into account conditionalities at different levels. And the IMF, of course, as you know, the IMF has not yet a program for Ukraine, but this will be a matter of discussion in October in Washington. What perhaps we could add to these traditional tools is to have, as we proposed, a common platform to collect and orient all the different contributions that will come apart from the big players to the reconstruction of Ukraine. This is the reason why the Commission proposed to have this common platform with the Ukrainian authorities, but this is not to define conditionalities. This is to orient and prioritize the contribution to Ukrainian reconstruction. And of course, this is justified and based upon the fact that Ukraine is working to join the European Union. It's not that we want to do this only for reasons of prestige. It's our task to work together with the Ukrainian authorities, and it's a process. You know, we had in the last 2 days the Association Council with Ukraine. Personally, I signed with my friend and colleague Marchenko a couple of agreements on taxes and on customs. So the process is going. This is very interesting, how the Ukrainian authorities are able to keep their economy and their services going. Yes, they have 23% of inflation, but they have a war. But I was talking with one of my colleagues coming back from Kiev. Schools are opening, and this effort is really impressive.
It is remarkable. Let's turn to the floor. can I have some questions, please? I have 1, 2 there. Let's maybe bundle 2 or 3. Let's start with Jacob in the back and then the gentleman in the front. Can you introduce yourself with your multiple institutions, Jacob?
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute and the German Marshall Fund. I'd like to follow up on Jeramin's question on Ukraine. I mean, right now the battlefield situation is obviously rapidly changing in Ukraine. The security situation in the parts of the country that are not directly affected by the war is improving. So it seems reasonable to begin to speculate of an accelerated reconstruction effort also in those parts of the country to restart the economy. Back in May, the Commission, in its communique on this launching the platform that you mentioned, also talked and discussed the longer-term financing requirements for the sort of rebuilding and reconstruction of the Ukrainian economy with, obviously ahead of EU accession, etc. And in that communication, the Commission, you speculated about the need for new financial instruments to finance that. And I was hoping you could, in the same way that you lifted the lid a little bit on what might be on the Stability and Growth Pact reform, could also elaborate a little bit on what you might think these additional financial instruments, presumably of a common nature, might look like ahead of the coming conference in Berlin between the Commission and the German G7 presidency in October. Thank you.
Very good. Maybe gentleman in the front. Unfortunately, I've forgotten your name, sir.
Kurt Geisert, I'm one of the guides in the House of European History. Japan depends massively on Russian gas. Can you understand their attitude that they continue to buy a lot of Russian gas?
Go ahead. If there's anything from the Slido that you want to take, feel free.
Yes. Well, honestly, my answer to the first question is that it is too soon to elaborate on new instruments, new tools, how we finance. I hope I didn't give you a too optimistic impression of the Ukrainian situation, because what I think is that the resilience and the military resistance was impressive, but I don't see, unfortunately, any sign of Putin available to change his plan. And traditionally, winter could be a moment where, if there are plans to relaunch the initiative in Ukraine by Russia, this could be the right time to try to do so. So I think for this, and final point, I was referring to pledges and support to Ukraine, but if we compare what we reached until now to the needs that were defined by IMF for the finance to Ukraine, we are lagging behind. So this is not a diplomatic answer because I don't want to reveal something. This is the fact that we are still working in supporting, and please note that this work will become harder in the coming months, because in our public opinion, the room of maneuver for people saying that electricity bills, crisis, etc., this is because of the sanctions, because of this, because of that, is there. We had big demonstration in countries like Czechia or Germany in recent days that should ring an alarm bell to all of us. So I think we should be concentrating in supporting Ukraine and in making the case of how important this support through sanctions and through economic and military aid is for our liberty, for our societies, and for our future as Europeans. As far as Japan is concerned, I can only say that we have a good cooperation with Japan in the main work stream in the G7, which is this work for a broad coalition to support a Russian oil price cap. We will need to extend this because it should not be perceived like a coalition of the West against the others. I'm quite confident that some other countries could join this group of 7 countries, and that countries that will not join the group formally will in any case benefit from the existence of this broad coalition pushing down prices. So we will, I think, work under the leadership of Janet Yellen, who is coordinating this kind of work on oil price cap, and Japan is strongly cooperating.
Thank you. Let's maybe take 2 questions from Slido. So there's one question that states, given the strong economy and labor market, you mentioned, should we not have a return to market dynamics? It probably means energy market dynamics instead of freezing it with subsidies to business. So I interpret the question as essentially alluding to the trade-off between the benefits of allowing price signals to work and the need to shield. How you think about that trade-off and how that may be reflected in Commission proposals. And then another question is on the relationship, if any, between the macroeconomic imbalance procedure and the reform of the fiscal rules. Could you give any indication how an improved MIP would play into the upcoming reform? Does it play into an upcoming reform? Does one have to think these things together or not?
Yes, on this second question, I would only say that, of course, the macroeconomic imbalance procedures will play a role. We will try to improve it. How to do so, we will, I think, have some details in the coming weeks. On the other question, of course, I refer to good level of growth, which are, by the way, quite different country to country. You know that we have high growth in some countries, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, and not so high growth in other countries. In Poland, for example, we have a clear negative. And in other countries like Germany, we have a flat situation. So the average is good, but when we say that we cannot exclude the perspective of a recession, I think we are not telling this to scare someone, but we are telling this because this is what many indicators are showing, despite the fact that we have temporarily good signals. We have also some more concerning signal in some countries. After the summer pause, we had some restart of mechanism of well, in Italy we call it cassa integrazione, but is like chômage partiel or short-time work schemes, Kurzarbeit, these kind of things. There are some signals that they are back. I would say, answering to this question, that the key point is try to have the subsidies, if we want to call them subsidies, targeted and temporary. Because subsidies are necessary. I think that we all have some relation with someone in politics at national level, and we all know that governments are moving to support in some ways. But it is obvious that there are sectors of business that are more affected than others. In other sectors, we have what we call now the windfall profits, not the big crisis. And as far as families are concerned, we presented 2 months ago, 3 months ago, a note as DG ECFIN showing how important is energy expenditure for the lower quintile of the income. And there you can have these expenditure around 14–15% of the total income, which is enormous. Because if this double, and it is 14% of your income, it's a big problem. But for the rest, or many of the rest, it's not, of course. But unfortunately, according to our survey, we are not yet there. So I wouldn't ask for a stop to subsidies and support because I think that it is not only unrealistic but wrong. We need support and subsidies, but please design them to make them really targeted to vulnerable and more energy-intensive sectors.
Thank you. So we know you have a plane to catch, so we will make this the last round of questions. I think we have actually 3, 4, 5. Well, that's actually a lot. Okay, fine. So we have, let's go in the orders. Simone, you had raised your hand. You go first, then Nicolas, then the lady in the front, and then we had the lady over here, and you, gentlemen, yes, and that's it. And please identify yourselves.
Hello, Commissioner. Simone Tagliapietra from Bruegel. Back in March, we started to have a conversation about whether it is a high time to have a sort of next generation EU2 to mutualize some of the expenditure that will be needed to face the energy shock. That discussion somehow muted over the last months. I wanted to ask you whether you see this conversation coming back in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicolas.
Thank you. Nicolas Veron at Bruegel. It's not strictly in your portfolio, so you may want to skip this, but since you made a number of comments on the economic strategy vis-à-vis Ukraine, I want to ask you a question about sanctions to Russia. The European Union has introduced sanctions, including blocking sanctions and cutting off from SWIFT on a number of Russian banks, but not all Russian banks. So there is a significant share of the Russian banking system that still is not touched by EU sanctions, and it's possible to introduce sanctions on those banks without preventing the kind of transactions on energy, food, humanitarian, pharmaceuticals, etc., that we want to keep going. So why is the EU not putting all Russian banks on the sanctions list, and will it happen soon? Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, please. We need the mic here in front.
Hi, Julia Anderson, EBRD. For the Ukraine, again, for the reconstruction phase, how concerned are you about the enduring influence of vested interests in politically connected firms? And do you think that EU accession will be a big enough stick, or will you expect more conditionality?
Thank you very much, also for keeping it concise. The lady with the black top over here.
Thank you, Palatama from Politico Europe. Hello, Commissioner. Simone asked what I wanted, so I'm going to go back to SGP. What exactly are reputational sanctions that you mentioned? Thank you.
Super. I think that's it, right? No, you're fine. Okay, great. So we have a question on essentially a common fund to incentivize energy measures and possibly do compensation for losers. We have a question on sanctions on Russian banks. We have a question of how worried should we be about vested interests in Ukrainian reconstruction. And then finally we have the question on the SGP reform that the lady just said.
Yes. Well, I'll be very, very short on the last question from Paola Tamma, and on the banks, on the first, we will give more detail when we will make our proposals. On the second, nothing is excluded, but if you ask me, my priority would be not so much to increase the number of banks, but to decrease the circumvention of sanction, which is unfortunately still working. On the reconstruction and vested interests, of course, we know that the Ukrainian authorities are really engaged in making the process as fast as possible of association with the Union. And we are completely available to work on this. At the same time, we also know that when the war will be over, there is an amount of reform that will be absolutely necessary in the level playing field, vested interests, functioning of the public administration. And I think, honestly, that the Ukrainian authorities are perfectly aware of this. To be aware doesn't mean that it's easy to solve these problems, because they are not problems easy to solve, but of course we are determined to contribute with them to their solution. Final point, what can we, because the easy answer would be, well, we have this Repower EU that we proposed in May, if I'm not wrong, which is, in a certain sense, a smaller version in the sense that you have in common money for grants and for loans raised by the European Commission. Amount difficult to define, but 20 billion of grants and maybe 100 and something billion of non-used loans for the Repower new chapters of RRF. I would add two things to this. First, if we move towards a energy package based on Article 122, we should always remember that in the 122 mechanism, solidarity is necessary. So among the conditions for eligibility of Article 122, there are urgency and many other things justifying the use of this legal tool. Also, solidarity means how to use this package also to address risks of fragmentation. Maybe the risks of fragmentation among member states will not be identical to the ones that we had during the COVID crisis, but the issue will come again. At the same time, personally, I am convinced of the fact that if the situation will evolve, and I hope it will not, in questioning the labor force on some sectors in connection with the energy crisis, the possibility to reopen a discussion on a mechanism similar to what we had and what we called SURE is there. I repeat, not now, because if we look now to, we have a record employment figures, not a wage of unemployment. But this is part of the uncertainty in the picture. So I would mention this: Repower EU, the need of solidarity in the energy package, and if needed, reopen this discussion will be, I think, important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. We will, and good luck. We will be cheering for you. We will be supporting you with ideas. We will sometimes be criticizing you, but mainly we will support you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.